we are not a pawn of America. We have our own strategic agency to decide for ourselves. The timeline shows that when the US left, then China started to make its presence felt in the West Philippine Sea. The fact is, China refuses to abide by international law. The former president, Duterte, really showed his affection for President Xi Jinping, but in return, China still continued to harass the Philippine Coast Guard. Now, under President Marcos since 2022, the more than 70-year-old alliance between the Philippines and the U.S. has strengthened. Will U.S. foreign policy change under the new administration of President Trump? We'll see how it unfolds.
How would you describe the relationship between the Philippines and China?
Actually, the most important foreign policy issue for the Philippines is really our relations with China, because China, of course, is a superpower, an economic power, especially in Asia, and its largest trading partner is ASEAN, or Southeast Asian countries, of which the Philippines is part of. So the Philippines wants to navigate relations with China so that the security aspect doesn't influence trade or investments or aid. In 2013, the Philippines won in its arbitration case against China. So it was a historic moment. Many parts of the world praised it. However, in the Philippines, at the time, our president was Rodrigo Duterte, who wasn't too keen on the victory. He really just dismissed the arbitral ruling, and he said it was just a piece of paper fit for the bin, because he decided to cast the lot of the Philippines with China. So he borrowed for infrastructure projects like dam, bridges, and then he allowed overseas offshore gambling operations in the Philippines, which targeted the Chinese market. So it was really a case of unrequited love, because Duterte really showed his affection for President Xi Jinping, but in return, many of the loans did not push through, and China still continued to harass the Philippine Coast Guard and the Navy vessels in the West Philippine Sea. So it was only after Duterte stepped down, when President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. came into power, that he tried to enforce the arbitral ruling. But since there's no international policeman to do this, the Philippines just stood its ground and did its patrols in what we call the West Philippine Sea, despite harassment from the China Coast Guard, China Navy, and the maritime militia. So even if international law is on our side, China rejected it. With President Marcos Jr., he has adopted the policy of standing up to China and making all the skirmishes in the West Philippine Sea transparent, meaning our Coast Guard embeds journalists who write about this, who show the video so that nothing is hidden from the public, and that is how the Filipinos learn about it, as well as the international community. Last year, this was the first time we saw a civil society group, a group of activists organized themselves. There were various groups, and did humanitarian mission to the West Philippine Sea. It was unprecedented. Got a lot of international media coverage because they hired their own boats, I think commercial boats, and they worked together with the Philippine Coast Guard. They coordinate with them to provide supplies to our troops in our features in the West Philippine Sea. So I think this really infuriated China, because they started a disinformation campaign against this group. It's a coalition called Atin Ito. Atin Ito is Filipino language for this is ours. There's a series of disinformation efforts from China saying that Atin Ito is funded by the Philippine government and the U.S. government. That's why Taiwan and the Philippines, we share some similar experiences, because in Taiwan, one of the main threads of the Chinese disinformation narrative is that Taiwan's alliance or friendship with the U.S. is in doubt. They undermine it. It's the same with the Philippines, that this information from China casts doubt as well on the Philippines' alliance with the U.S. We're the pawn, we're being used in this game, in this global game. But the fact is, China refuses to abide by international law. For them, might is right. So that's why the Philippines went to the International Arbitral Court to have this case decided upon. You know, foreign policy is not really talked about in the Philippines. We're going to have midterm elections in May 2025. It's now becoming an issue, but it's very limited to our relations with China. So that's the difficult balancing act now that is happening in the Philippines under President Marcos. The Philippines and China are ramping up diplomatic efforts to arrive at agreements to avoid violent incidents in the West Philippine Sea.
How is the Philippines building regional security and economic alliances?
It's very interesting because from 2022, under President Marcos's time, there is one block of countries that hasn't really supported the Philippines completely. That's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and these are our neighbors in Southeast Asia. So that's what the Philippines is trying to work on now, is to really gain the support of more of the Southeast Asian countries. The Philippines entered into an economic, maritime, and defense cooperation with Vietnam. Same with Brunei, there's maritime cooperation, trade cooperation, economic as well. Malaysia, that's still a sensitive issue because the Philippines has a claim over Sabah, one of its islands. So the goal is for claimant countries in Southeast Asia to stand up to China and come up with a united position. Because the entire Southeast Asian region, it's difficult for them to come up with just one position against China because Laos, Cambodia are dependent on China. Although Indonesia, the largest member of ASEAN, is not a claimant country, but it has also maritime conflicts with China. So it's very important that the Philippines and other claimant countries in Southeast Asia come together and have a united stand against China when it comes to maritime dispute. Countries like Vietnam and Malaysia do not necessarily agree with the approach of the Philippines, which the Philippine government calls transparency initiative or transparency policy. They think we're too noisy and too loud because we tell the world what's happening. So the Vietnamese and the Malaysians want to keep things quiet. They don't want to offend China precisely because of economic reasons. That's why the Philippines also listened to Vietnam and to Malaysia in discussions, and the Philippines, while it still continues to be transparent, it has sort of de-escalated. It's not just high notes the whole time. You know, there are times when the Philippine government pauses and there's quiet, and then there are times that it announces a new, maybe confrontation or the illegal patrols of China. So I think the Philippines is also learning from its neighbors like Vietnam and Malaysia, because the reality is the Philippines needs also to have economic engagement with China. Among the Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines was among the last to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Still, having said that, the Philippines doesn't want to be dependent on just China or the US. That's why it's diversifying also its sources of investments as well as security engagements.
How would you describe the relationship between the Philippines and the US?
The majority sentiment is really positive towards America. Just last year, a very credible survey asked the question of how can the Philippines strengthen its defense against China? How can it protect its sovereign rights? And they say one way is by strengthening the Philippines' alliance with America. And the other part of the survey asked, what countries do you trust? What countries should the Philippines work with? America came first, I think Australia, Japan, and towards the end is China. You know, there's also this sentiment in the Philippines that we are not a pawn of America. We have our own strategic agency to decide for ourselves. Just to cite an example, the Philippines kicked out the American bases in the early 1990s. And after that, in 1995, China grabbed Mischief Reef, one of the features that lies within our exclusive economic zone. And it didn't stop there. It created a military base. And then in 2011, China stopped Philippine ships from serving for oil and gas in our own exclusive economic zone. And 2013, China started reclaiming some of the features and building artificial islands. It was only in 2014 when the Philippines entered into an agreement with America, which they call Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, in response to what China had been doing. The timeline shows that when the US left, then China started to make its presence felt in the West Philippine Sea. Under the former President, Duterte, the relationship weakened or soured a bit because Duterte hated America for criticizing his war on drugs, which was very violent, which led to thousands of killings. So there was really that contentious relationship. Now, under President Marcos, since 2022, the more than 70-year-old alliance between the Philippines and the US has strengthened. And this strengthening has led to more multilateral formations. For example, there's a Philippines, Japan, US trilateral cooperation, both security and in the economic sphere. And then there's also a quadrilateral engagement among US, Japan, Philippines, and Australia when it comes to security issues. So our strengthening of alliance with the US led to more multilateral formations as well as multilateral military exercises in the West Philippine Sea. Now, we've seen a number of firsts. For example, France sent its warship to do joint exercises with the Philippines. This is first. Australia has sent, but this is not the first time. New Zealand is now going to sign a visiting forces agreement with the Philippines. Next is Canada, and next is France. So there are like 3 countries just now which will forge visiting forces agreements. This is aside from economic cooperation. So there's a lot going on. Maybe the only uncertain point really is, will U.S. foreign policy change under the new administration of President Trump? We'll see how it unfolds.